Hello, everyone, and welcome. What an exciting series of presentations and discussions over the last couple of days. We hope to build on many of these conversations with this session on evaluating impact with a racial equity and social justice lens in a global context. I'm Leslie Pine, Managing Partner of the Philanthropic Initiative. Our mission at TPI is to help funders increase the impact of their philanthropy. And in our 32 plus years of operation, we've worked with a wide range of funders who care deeply about equity and social justice. Many funders have come to us with questions about impact, effective partnerships, measurement, how to learn from what's not measurable, how to use evaluation to learn and inform thinking about their philanthropic strategies and approaches. And not surprisingly, we're seeing growing interest in equity-centered evaluation work. With that as some background, I'm delighted to be co-leading this workshop with Sebastian Frias from the Kellogg Foundation and my very talented colleague, Joe Lee, Senior Philanthropic Advisor at TPI. I'm going to let Sebastian and Joe briefly introduce themselves.
Thank you, Leslie. Joe, if you want to go ahead.
Sure. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everyone out there. Joe Lee here in Boston, Massachusetts. I work with Leslie as TPI as a senior advisor. Really excited to be here with all of you and with Leslie and Sebastian to talk about evaluation, which is something that I know all of us care very deeply about.
All right. Thank you so much, Joe, and Leslie. It's such a pleasure to be here with you today. I'm deeply honored to be doing this work with all of you. My name is Sebastian Frias. I'm a program manager with the Kellogg Foundation. I've been working for the foundation for the past 9 years, and I've had the privilege to work on different teams within Mexico, Haiti, our program in Brazil and Africa, our racial equity team. And it will be a pleasure to share a little bit of what I've learned throughout these years. And thank you. It's great to be here.
Next slide, please. So I hope everyone who's participating in this workshop has had the opportunity to join the various keynotes and sessions over the last couple of days. I want to call out in particular yesterday's plenary session with Lee Pelton and Theo Soa, which I, for one, found incredibly inspiring. Theo shared some really important messages about who to listen to and how we listen. And her messages, I think, provide some really great context for this workshop. We're going to start with key considerations and challenges in evaluating philanthropic strategies in a global context. We'll then take a step back and review some evaluation basics. Sebastian is going to then share a little bit about the Kellogg Foundation's story, its theory of change, strategies, along with some community perspectives. And we'll also talk about some tools and approaches for listening and obtaining input from stakeholders with diverse perspectives, including those who are closest to the issues that we're trying to address. And we'll leave you with a few questions to consider as you map out your own next steps with your philanthropy. We know everyone who's joining us this afternoon is at a different stage in their philanthropic journey. And I know some of you, it's not afternoon, it might be morning or evening, but to provide a sense of the range of who we have as participants on a few questions, we'll ask you to take a few polls along the way. And we also invite everyone to post questions in the chat box throughout the session. We'll take a few minutes later in the session and do our best to respond to some of those questions. We want to start with the first two polling questions. And the first one, how would you describe your current approach to evaluating the impact of your philanthropy? We have 3 choices. Perhaps you've already adopted equity-centered evaluation approaches. Perhaps you're just getting started exploring how to adopt equity-centered evaluation approaches. Option C, you don't know what equity-centered evaluation is or how to incorporate it into your work. And while you're pondering your answer to that question, let's look at polling question number 2. And this question, we are curious to know for all of you, what portion of your philanthropy involves giving across borders in countries other than the one where you or your foundation is based? And we have 4 choices here that you can see. So we'll give folks a minute or so to respond to those questions. And in the meantime, let's continue on, because we know it does take a little bit of time for us to be able to see the poll results. So I just want to briefly share what we see as our primary goals for this workshop. One is to share examples and challenges of assessing funding opportunities and impact of efforts to advance equity and social justice. A second goal is to talk about ways to collect input and elevate voices of grantees and others in a global context as an integral component of equity-centered evaluation. And a third goal is to explore how input and engagement of diverse stakeholders can help to inform and enhance our philanthropic strategies and approaches. Let's see, I think we're seeing some poll results. I'm just looking to see if we can share some of this. Yeah, so right now we have almost 1/3 participants say they have adopted equity-centered evaluation approaches. About 43% are just beginning to explore and adopt equity-centered evaluation approaches. And almost 1/3 are not certain what equity-centered evaluation is or how to incorporate it. So that's an interesting, roughly equal mix across the 3 options. And then in terms of giving across borders, we have 11% said you're not doing that yet. 11%, less than 50% of your philanthropy involves giving across borders. Large numbers, 67% say 50% or more of your giving is across borders, and 11% are at 100% of your giving. So that's really interesting and really helpful to just get a sense of the range of folks that we have. So this session, as we've talked about, is about evaluation with an equity lens, which of course raises the question of what it means to center equity in evaluation. There are many ways to define equity and equity-centered evaluation. We like the definition that was developed by the Equitable Evaluation Framework. It represents a shared vision informed by foundations and others in the field of philanthropy, and it describes equity-centered evaluation as evaluations that are conceptualized, implemented, and used in a manner that promotes equity and that helps to answer questions about ways in which historical and structural decisions have contributed to the condition to be addressed, the effects of a strategy on different populations and on underlying systemic drivers of inequity, and ways in which cultural context may influence both structural conditions and the change initiative itself. Second, equity-centered evaluations incorporate diverse voices in design, implementation, and analysis. And third, they're multiculturally valid. And what we mean by that is that evaluation findings and resulting judgments are valid across multiple dimensions of cultural diversity. Evaluation with a strong equity lens can help you as a funder to better understand what impact and influence you're having in the communities you care about, and can also engage those communities in ways that further your equity goals. Equity-centered evaluation can also shift the focus of evaluation efforts in ways that can be beneficial to multiple stakeholders, raising issues like who asks the questions, who owns and interprets the data, who benefits from the evaluation findings and recommendations. I'm now going to turn things over to Sebastian to talk about these and other questions and challenges in a global context. Take it away, Sebastian.
Thank you so much, Leslie. I think this is a great way to start our workshop. Before we dive into it, we have an additional polling question for all of you. If we can show the next slide, please. So our polling question number 3 is, in your foundation's effort to advance equity and social justice outside of the US, what would you describe as the greatest challenges for you as a funder? And A, developing or refining our theory of change and strategies, finding and assessing funding opportunities, evaluating impact, using evaluation and key learnings to modify our strategies, or other. And if you choose other, you can also use the chat in the session to tell us what are those other challenges you're facing. Next slide, please. So when we were preparing this workshop, we thought that it was very important to set the ground for this conversation. We know that we're gonna go directly into evaluation and get into the nitty-gritty of it, but we thought it's very important to take a moment to think about, why do we do with this work? What are the challenges we have to do this work? And I have to say, global is a very tricky word, because while we are connected and we might work in different countries, something that's truly global is very challenging. Something that encompasses the diversity, the depth and width of the world is complex. So I don't know if I can really talk about global, but definitely international, and maybe a perspective that can help bridge different works. So I'll start with saying that this work is deeply close to me. We know that there are many challenges to address, and at the forefront of any good evaluation is the definition of what we are trying to achieve. I think this work requires a deep understanding and relationship with our humanity. Equity, and really the idea of humans being equal, the idea that you can see anyone to their eyes and know for sure that you are connected with them and that you can truly feel as equals, can be very powerful. And I think it sounds simple, but because every structure and system we are part of today is built and designed to deliver a lot of contradictory messages. You know, there is this idea that we need to be better than others, that in order to succeed, we need to prove ourselves in relation to others, that we need to stand out, that the only way we can succeed is by holding on to our advantages or privilege. Yet we know deeply inside of us that we are part of something larger. So we thought this was a good way of centering this workshop. I'll share some of my personal reflections for grounding as well. One of the things I like to start with is just accepting the fact that advocating for equity is uncomfortable, and that a lot of times, especially in philanthropy, is contradictory. Doing racial equity work, gender equity, social justice, human rights work from philanthropy is very uncomfortable. And I think it has to be uncomfortable in the face of everything we get to see from here. So many contradictions and inequalities. We get to advocate for change from very privileged positions. But above all, I think it leads us to ask ourselves very uncomfortable questions about our own stories, about our own belonging, where we're coming from. I think once we accept that this uncomfortableness, it's very important to learn how to move forward. And I can tell you, I've been there. You know, I felt guilt. I felt I'm not the one supposed to be leading or collaborating in these efforts. But how do we center community? How do we move forward from those feelings? And I think it's just having the opportunity to engage with communities that face complex challenges can be very unsettling. You know, like being aware of our privilege can make you feel inadequate. But this can be one of our major roadblocks too. I've seen so many people that are trapped in these feelings. So what I've found useful is to acknowledge these feelings, to really tell myself it's okay to be feeling this. It's not okay to get to see all of these challenges in the world, inequities. How do you use that to ground yourself and to find your role as a partner and as an ally? Um, the third thing is, I think we can take responsibility of our actions, but it's really important to not make it about ourselves. And I think we, over the years, I've seen explicit and implicit how savior complex plays out. This thing about positionality, like knowing that where we're working from is important. And I think it's important to acknowledge we all experience pains and diverse experiences of oppression. But just by being in this room, in this workshop, we know and we can recognize that in one way or another, we've all benefited from these inequity systems. We get to do this work with at least financial security and a platform. And I know, especially for racialized people and other diversely intersectional oppressions in philanthropy, can get very tricky because we have to acknowledge a lot of challenges we're still facing in the sector. However, when we engage community, we must enter with the assumption that we are the ones required to learn about inequality, not the other way around. Theory is incredible. It helps us expand our understanding, but it will never be above experience. And we can read about poverty, about inequities, about oppression, but that has nothing to do with experiencing every day. Starting with the fact that for us, learning about oppression and inequality is a choice and not an imposition. As individuals, we didn't build the inequities in these systems, and we will not change them by ourselves. We all have a role to play, and change needs to come from all places. I like to think of the role of philanthropy as facilitators of resources, of course, but also of connections, of collaborations. We get to disrupt the very same structures that perpetuate inequities and accumulations of resources and power. We get to question the accumulation of social capital in the elites, but again, we must be very careful to not make our role as facilitators become commodified or unaware of the negative impacts we may produce in any given ecosystem. That's why evaluation is so important, because we can really understand and learn where our intentions meet our outcomes. Another thing, racial equity is ultimately community work. For me, it requires deep trust and connection with people. What we are doing today in this workshop and throughout these 3 days is community work in a way, seeing in others the possibility of tackling problems that ourselves alone could never imagine solving. Community work requires getting involved with others, being vulnerable, building trust, asking for help. And I was asking myself last night, when was the last time I was vulnerable and asked for help from grantees or from a community member? And it's just that, like, I believe if we want to see those outcomes, we need to be an example of that. It's centering our work in our capacity to see each other as humans. Something else that I think is key to the evaluation is transformation. When we talk about transformation, we really need to understand what are those practices that are striving for transformation, what conditions are allowing or not allowing those practices to transform, and what outcomes. And I do see a lot of good intentions right now. I think worldwide there are good intentions for change, but intentions by themselves will not be enough. And I don't want you to get me wrong, intentions and integrity are crucial to our work, but we don't evaluate But when we don't evaluate how practices, conditions, and outcomes change, we are doing a disservice to our own missions and to our own intentions. And lastly, I'll just share, I think we need to prep for the long run. For me, it took me a long time to understand this very precisely. I've been working in philanthropy since I was very young, and it took me time, pain, frustration, to learn to have patience. And I think it's really, how can we be patient with everything going on in the world? And I'm not saying it's not important to have milestones and short-term goals, but transforming these centuries-old systems is not going to happen fast. And when we push ourselves to the limits, it's not sustainable. So everything happening in our communities today, we need to take care of each other. We really do. We really need to be there for each other and lean to each other. So after this, I'll share some key lessons learned from our practice in different countries. If you can go to the next slide, please. One thing that I think is starting to pop up in a lot of conversations right now is how do we think about different inequities globally? And I really like one thing that the Kellogg Foundation has done in codifying how we talk about racial equity in particular. And it's these ideas of the belief we have in our systems of the false hierarchies of human value. The way I describe that is, and now I'll show an example very shortly, but just this idea that some people are more valuable than others, and how do we dismantle systems that privilege some lives versus other lives. And I think that's true to every single country, unfortunately, in this planet. And I think that concept is useful because then we can look at data and we can define what are those structural barriers that we are trying to address. I think that this is super crucial. Every time we've worked, not even in different countries, in different communities or states or municipalities within a country like Mexico or like Haiti, in Brazil, going back to the local history, understanding where those structural barriers came from, gathering socioeconomic and demographic data of what's going on, really illustrates those false hierarchies of human value, but also it can help you understand how to talk about the issues you're trying to address. I'm going to talk a little bit more about field scans and power mapping that can help you lay a very good foundation for the work. But I think this question of what are you trying to address is crucial. The other thing is we talk a lot about centering communities and seeking underrepresented voices. But this, for the Kellogg Foundation, doesn't mean to invite or include people at a set table, but to allow for their input to reshape and expand and transform the table. So it's not really like, come here and give us your perspective, but really is like, what is the table you want to build? Who are the stakeholders that are missing? Another very, very important thing we've learned through our work internationally is the importance of language and culture and centering it. I know it's a challenge we face, and virtually it can be an even extra hurdle, but having events, engagements in the local languages is key. It's so used to right now that we just go with defaulting to English for every interaction we have. And this is very disruptive for communities, doesn't allow for people to show up from their culture, centering their culture. So just allowing for every interaction you have to be supported by a culturally responsive approach, by centering language is key. And it's also at the center of healing. And this, I think, is connected with leveraging your local staff, the community members leading the initiatives, and how do you really create the space and the conditions for these voices to set their tables. I think also, I already mentioned this, but I think globally doesn't mean one size fits all. Of course, we can replicate approaches. I think understanding local history, culture, I've mentioned things that you can replicate, but I think effective local strategies are built from local leadership agendas, efforts, and momentum. And I think we have to do a lot of homework when we enter community to understand what are those agendas, what are those efforts, and the conditions. That momentum I'm talking about is really understanding, is this the right moment to have this conversation, to support this agenda, to support these efforts? I think it's very obvious, but in any given country, international philanthropy will always be disruptive to all sectors. But I think my question is, what do we need to build into our practice to be aware and address any negative consequences? And I think we'll see that through the workshop about assessing our own negative consequences. but it's always having in our minds how disruptive we can be as international philanthropy. And lastly, I think it's very, very important to think about what are we extracting for a community. I've seen a very, very wide number of initiatives that produce diagnostics, reports, and never go back to community. And we publish them and we have excellent data, but it never gets delivered to community. And so how are we replicating this extractivism, this neo-colonialism that my colleague Dana was talking about on Wednesday? And what are we giving back from that work, from what we learned from communities? So I'm gonna share some examples of what I've been talking about. If you can go to next slide, please. When we started our racial equity work in Mexico, it was really a taboo topic. We scanned out who were the stakeholders talking about racial inequality or racism in Mexico. And while we found a lot of scholars in prestigious universities talking about human rights, about income inequality, the conversation about racism was not there, and people were not willing to do so. And being Mexican myself, I had to go through my own journey to understand why. Why was it so uncomfortable for people in Mexico to talk about this? And it has to do, it's deeply tied to our history. I think every community that struggles to have a conversation about inequality is because it's deeply tied to their identity, to the idea of the nation state, to their culture. But one thing that was key to unlock the power of conversation in a way that it wasn't rooted in opinions or just random assessments of what was going on was evidence. And there wasn't much evidence, but after seeking, we found people that were gathering evidence. So the first image is an example of an experiment that consisted in sending fictitious resumes responding to job advertisement, and they used randomized information of the applicants, which included photographs that, it's really interesting, but they used like AI to not actually put the faces of people, but it were like fictitious faces. But they represented three distinct phenotypes, which was white, mestizo, and indigenous. And the results were very clear. Like there were two forms of discrimination very correlated. One is against indigenous looking females and against married females. So we saw that women, particularly indigenous women, were not getting callbacks from resumes. This information gathered and used to have conversations with the private sector has been crucial to opening up that conversation. And then the other piece is using statistics, and we did a lot of work with the census, but one of the academics that was involved with this has been doing a lot of work in social stratification, the distribution of wealth, and this index combined that sort of distribution of wealth and racial ethnic self-identification, which is now included in the census for pretty much everyone in Mexico, language, skin tone. And what we saw is what I've been talking about, the false hierarchies of human value. At the top of the wealth accumulation and distribution we have our self-ascribed white or mestizo population that are not indigenous or that do not speak an indigenous language. We have a gradient, and at the bottom of this pyramid, of this hierarchy, is indigenous people that speak an indigenous language and with a certain age group. So this is just things that we invested on this research. We supported this research because we knew it would impact every single work and initiative we did in Mexico. If you could go to the next slide, please. And we'll talk more about other tools, but I think especially when entering any new community anywhere, but also particularly internationally, conducting field scans and power mapping has been crucial for our work too. I think field scans we conduct a lot of them, but it's really knowing about the trends and the debates. And one of our, for example, in Mexico, one of our most important results was there weren't being debates about racism. I mean, that was a big thing to learn. There wasn't even an open debate, no? And this was something that we wanted to push forward and that we wanted to help elevate. Similarly, with the current, with the policy environment, international frameworks have been very helpful for activists in Mexico. And so learning how the inter-American system started elevating more and more the anti-racism convention was really important to also meet sort of where the movement was and where the international work was. But also is like learning what is the history related to inequity and its effects, especially as it informs current inequities and the dynamics in the field. It was very important to know who were the players. As I said, we did a scan and we saw that most academics talking about inequality in Mexico were members of the elite, white, and were not really representing what was going on in the country. So it took us a long time to find the right voices to open up this conversation. And then power mapping, which is really after, well, one thing I'll say more about field scan is, I think we all want to be innovative in our practice. We all want to bring our organizations to the forefront of what's going on, but we're really not inventing much. I mean, there's so many good organizations doing good work out there. For us, it was crucial to understand what other peers in the philanthropic space were doing, really understand how we could partner and not try to start from zero. I think we have no time to start from zero. We really need to understand that. And then for power mapping, I think just visually mapping those dynamics, those power dynamics in community, who has more leverage, who has more platforms, voices, power, but also how do we, and again, how do we account for our own power as a foundation and our presence in community? And who are the key influencers? We saw that sometimes there are stakeholders that maybe are not wielders of big power or decision making, but they are big influencers, and that has helped a lot with our change strategies. So I'll leave it up to there right now, turning it back to Joe and Leslie, but we'll continue looking at some examples of this. Thank you.
Thank you, Sebastian, for those just really meaningful reflections and for the summary about the urgency for effective evaluations in a global context. With that in mind, we also wanted to spend a little bit of time talking through some evaluation basics. So some of this might be new to you, other parts might be ideas and practices that you're already using every day. But wherever you are, I just encourage you to begin thinking through potentially reframing or modifying some of what you're currently doing. As Sebastian mentioned earlier, some questions to ask yourself are, how do local histories and structural barriers come into play, and how can we do kind of more intentional work to make sure that the evaluations reflect our answers to those questions. Next slide, please. So this is TPI's framework for high impact philanthropy. So we think about the evaluation not as a separate siloed event that happens after strategy is implemented or a grant is completed, but rather it's really integral to all phases of a strategic planning and implementation cycle. So evaluation can be defined broadly as questioning and assessing and listening and reflecting, but it's not something that is preserved in amber. It's part of an ongoing and iterative process with multiple feedback loops, and it should be infused into everything that funders do or should be doing. Next slide. So why evaluate? Ultimately, it comes down to what is it that you most want to find out? Are you most concerned about accountability, whether you or your grantee partners did what you and they had proposed? Maybe you'd like to use this information to improve or course correct the partner's work more midstream. You might be looking to understand the impact of your philanthropy more broadly, to use what you've learned to inform and improve future strategies and grant-making decisions. Or you might want to use evaluation to help your grantee partners achieve their goals and to help them build their internal capacity for measurement, evaluation, and learning. And that's something we'll talk about more later today. And are you open to sharing learnings with other funders and practitioners and the grantees in order to help inform your own strategies and practices more broadly? So for those of you who are just beginning to commit more fully to evaluation, think about what is most important to you or your foundation. What do you most want to learn, and how will evaluation findings be used in actionable and meaningful ways? It's that kind of clarity that will help shape your evaluation approaches. Next slide, please. So for many funders, the question of what to evaluate really has to do with the scope of evaluation. For example, do you want to assess specific grants or a cluster of grants? And then moving to the next level, are you eager to evaluate progress towards specific goals or objectives? And then even more broadly, what approaches would help you to assess and inform your philanthropic strategies and approaches, or your policies and your practices? Again, these questions will help you to create an evaluation approach that makes most sense for you. Next slide. So what do you think of when you hear the word evaluation? For some, it's about monitoring, which is perhaps the simplest approach, or in other words, it's about helping funders to understand whether grantees did what they set out to do. Measurement is also a key term. What exactly changed as a result of your philanthropic investments? For example, you might be asking how many or how much as an output. But when we talk about evaluating impact, we're going back to that original question, so what? Put in another way, it's not just about the how muches or the how manys, but what was the long-term impact of this assessment? And we appreciate and we like the terms assessment and learning, since it emphasizes the importance of listening, processing, and reflecting. And it's all rooted in the big picture questions that will help to advance your overarching goals. Next slide, please. Now, for funders that create a theory of change, which we'll get to in a second, it can be helpful to also develop a logic model or a framework for connecting specific goals and activities to desired outputs. And you can think of outputs as concrete data, for example, how many people were served by the program, as well as outcomes, which are tangible results of those original activities. And then this ultimately brings us to that, again, original question, so what? What was the long-term impact of your philanthropy, and what did it help to achieve? Next slide. So as I mentioned before, many funders find it helpful to develop a theory of change to guide their strategies and approaches, which really is all about spelling out your assumptions that connect actions and then connecting that to any hoped for results. They can help explain why certain strategies are being used, how and in what sequence they'll actually achieve the desired result. So for example, a funder focusing on vaccination efforts in a particular region may ground a grant strategy in a theory of change that community health centers in rural areas are critical to enhancing vaccination access. Whereas the theory of change for another funder with very similar goals may focus on accompaniment training via community health workers. So regardless of the details, both theories of changes would ideally be rooted in evidence-based research. Next slide. So why create a theory of change? Really, there's a whole constellation of reasons for why you might want to do this. Sitting down with your colleagues and your internal and external stakeholders, Doing this active work can really help uncover assumptions you didn't realize existed. It might also assist in the design of your programs and your strategies, or reveal opportunities where you might look outwards for additional collaboration and partnerships. A theory of change should also inform how you design your evaluation, since a good theory of change will connect, again, actions with those hoped for results. And lastly, a theory of change can help prevent mission creep, which can often happen when you're, really deep in the work. The theory of change can serve as a kind of North Star to keep you focused on that original mission. Tensions and challenges. So I know that many of you are probably already very familiar with many of these tensions that we've listed here, but I wanted to provide a few comments that hopefully lend some nuance to these topics. So we know that not every single thing can be measured, no matter what a data scientist will tell you, and that sometimes measuring something can change what you're actually observing. Long time horizons can also be a huge concern. Some of the biggest challenges we're facing, whether that's climate change or democracy or education, those are all really big topics that can be difficult to evaluate over the long term, which necessitate maybe more proximate or immediate ways of collecting data and measuring impact. Capacity for data collection comes up time and time again in our conversations with funders and grantee partners. There's a real cost when it comes to doing evaluations, and asking your grantees to do that work sometimes isn't possible without also looking at their own internal capacity needs. And it can be hard to pinpoint whether you're identifying whether your program has actually caused the observed outcomes, which would be an attribution, versus whether you want to know if your program helped to cause an observed outcome, which would be more of a contribution. So that's another factor to consider. And the ecosystem versus test tube concept is really important, since it encourages us to understand that variables can come into play on a macro and a systems level. We know that the ground beneath you is always shifting, and so your goals may be evolving in real time too. Getting candid feedback can also be very difficult, especially as we talked about, given the deep historical dynamics at play, the imbalance that funding relationships can throw even more off kilter. Or lastly, are there other perspectives, other diverse perspectives, who not only should be part of the conversation, but who really need to be involved in order for the evaluation to be most effective? So I realize I've thrown a lot at you, and I encourage you to throw more questions into the chat box. But in the meantime, I am going to pause and hand things back over to, I believe, I'm blanking now, it's Sebastian.
Yes, thank you, Joe. So we wanted to share some very concrete examples. I'm going to talk very briefly about the Kellogg Foundation's DNA theory of change, and then we're gonna show some work from our grantees and communities we work with. So a few years ago, actually like 4 years ago, I was invited to join an internal group at the foundation to try to codify something that was brewing that we called our DNA. And we think through the leadership of our CEO, Lejeune Montgomery Tabron, we identified that there were three things that were cross-cutting from the work we've been doing since the beginning of the foundation, which was really our racial equity approach, our community engagement approach, and our leadership approach. And we thought of this as what's at the core of what the foundation is doing and our values. But we also call it DNA because it's it's composed of three approaches that are interdependent. We built this frame and this theory of change, starting from just understanding what was the legacy of our founder, of course, but also the legacy of the foundation through so many years of grant making and presence in community. But we knew it was important to, we knew that people at the foundation knew what racial equity was, what our approach for community engagement or leadership. But sometimes we started noticing that there were nuances, that there were differences in how everyone understood the work. And so we knew we had to create a theory of change that really help us focus and help everyone had the same understanding of what those approaches were, but also that the practice was aligned. So we used a human-centered design approach and design thinking, just to really get everyone in the building and outside of the building to involved in the creation of this approach. But also it was this idea within design called collective sense making. So everyone could really understand and digest and say, okay, when being part of the Kellogg Foundation as a staff member, I know exactly what we mean when we're saying racial equity. So the first thing was creating definitions for these three approaches, and very, very clear definitions. I shared a little bit about how we define our approach on racial equity, just going again against this idea of the false hierarchies of human value. The same thing with community engagement and with leadership. So that was sort of a very important first step. These approaches, having them very clear, everyone making sense of what they were, but also creating a set of goals, activities, and outcomes that would really bring this theory of change into life. So I'll talk really briefly again about sort of what's in the intersection of these things. But what we think is at the core of racial equity is seeking underrepresented voices, and we all already see that, and we see that as part of that shared vision and that intersection between community engagement, engaging community, and racial equity. We also thought about who's part of the process and why is it critical question to help rebalance power in the interactions between people. And that's sort of the interaction between our racial equity and our leadership approach, and building that authorizing environment for leaders to actually step into that role. The other thing about community engagement is it's a process, but also it's a mindset of identifying collective assets to leverage for change on behalf of the whole rather than supporting individual interests. And then from the leadership perspective, also how decisions are made and how decisions are communicated. So as you see, we clearly defined sort of what was in the intersection of these three approaches, but also we established goals. And I'll just put, because we have them for the three approaches, but I'll just put the example of racial equity. So we strive to create and sustain policies and systems which allow all persons to leverage the policies and systems to achieve shared goals, support a racial healing process that provides necessary structure to allow full participation. And then the activities is like Kellogg Foundation staff socialize those standards and practices that embed and sustain racial equity into the organizational culture. We recruit, we retain and develop diverse staff and use metrics to establish and mark progress towards staff diversity goals. We deploy grant-making guide to assist staff with embedding racial equity into all investments. We implement a process for onboarding new staff to create baseline awareness, etc. And then very clear outcomes, right? Like there is an aligned vision and strategy among WKKF staff of how racial equity is applied to all of the work of the foundation. External partners are held accountable to the application of racial equity in WKKF strategies, and it's applied in their work. We developed infrastructure to support the deepening of racial equity work within and outside of the foundation. So just to say is this, I think while you're building your own internal plans, this is obviously very internal looking, but it was very important for us to have something, a theory of change that could both be very clear on what we were trying to achieve, but also have very specific goal activities and outcomes. And then what we've been doing throughout the years is calibrating, like, is this working? Are we really achieving this? We have very specific systems to evaluate if this theory of change is working or not. And then the next thing that we wanted to show a little bit too is how impact is seen as well in different ways. And so if we could take what I've just mentioned about our DNA for the Kellogg Foundation and apply it to the field, we're going to show a video right now of the program in Mexico. The video is, and I'll just introduce the video and then we'll be able to watch it. But this video is from a participatory planning process that started in 2011. It included a lot of different communities in Southeast Mexico, in the Yucatan Peninsula and Chiapas. But it also included very particular groups of community members: artisans, honey and coffee producers, midwives, youth. And really the idea is, as we shared, trying to build those new tables and really changing the approach and our own goals and objectives to be established by community, to really be established by that process. And we learned a lot. And when we were preparing this workshop, we talked a lot about how can we create spaces where in philanthropy we talk more about the lessons learned, yes, the successes, but also the challenges and the mistakes we made. And I think throughout this process, the only thing, I think the video will speak for itself. It's our grantees and community members. One thing we learn is there's a lot of care and thought that needs to be done while prepping for planning. You cannot be planning eternally. Communities have very real, hard, and complex problems today that they need to solve. And there needs to be a balance between what's achieved today and what's achieved in the medium and long term. And it took us several iterations. It took us a lot of trust and getting feedback from our grantees, from community members, to know what we needed to adjust, to know that maybe some of our priorities at the beginning were not responding to the community's priorities. But anyways, I don't want to take more time, but I'll if you have any questions, there's the chat. And please, if you can put the video.
Nos juntamos y nos juntamos así en grupo y para empezar a hacer nuestros proyectos. Y entonces ya así nosotros vemos qué nos hace falta y pedir los apoyos.
Más que apoyar o más que trabajar con la gente, es colaborar con las personas para ver cómo juntos desarrollamos mecanismos que nos permitan pues ir encontrando soluciones comunes, ¿no?
Lo que acá hay visco ti reuniones o ti pláticas o ti talleres o tansha kahilo katuka oto yana chupalalo tansha kahilo kapukalu visco bao beyo kamas ushatu yicho.
Pues cajone yash binon cholul teklas mochakba ton tulak non bay tulak cajobo capaz que propuesta ton tulak non bay katek mochakba. Pues anchas ton comunicación bay igual tume tulak non de propuesta me machon way que yo veces problemas.
Hay llega kichvel hotik be llega possibility hotik del suk de anseti que la soba hotik hotik hayel de bit il ay vintage hotik to local el suk de anseti que
más o menos cambiar la visión de la gente, ¿no? Cambiar esto es lo que existe, pero hay este otro camino, ¿no? Que viene más que nada con el deseo, con los sueños, con lo que uno quiere o anhela como persona.
Hay igual ya gente bit establish benote Tarikina tahtikiana que derecho que le causa que vamos.
Una de esos, los proyectos que teníamos era de compartir experiencias y en eso entra de que, aunque sea mi vecino, pero en ningún momento pasó por mi mente que sabía hacer esa actividad de otra forma. Y entonces, al hacer eso, mejoramos.
Están, digamos, en un punto en el que reconocen sus fortalezas, reconocen su identidad y sobre todo su trabajo colectivo, ¿no? Y esa parte proyectada al mundo pues es importantísima.
Teatro es que cansa anchata y la me machan la cuna me llana honi me llana tu la grupo me cada tu le yo he bash con bete yo am bash servir san del equipo cada tu le tu integrante indispensable que de ubechel meya.
Yo lo que cambiaría sería muchas cosas. ¿Qué podría decir? Que empezábamos desde los pueblos chicos y avanzando así hasta terminar en las ciudades. Es lo que me imagino yo.
Y nos empiezan a platicar de lo que quieren hacer, de lo que están empezando a hacer, de lo que están imaginando para 20 años. Y eso ya es una parte importante porque trasciende ya esa temporalidad y comienza a hablar de una generación.
Cada persona, cada municipio, cada comunidad tiene su forma de ver la vida y la diferencia es lo que nos hace grandiosos. Como organizaciones tenemos que pensar en eso y también tenemos que pensar que un modelo puede ser replicable en otra comunidad siempre y cuando se pueda mejorar, siempre y cuando la gente pueda reflexionar sobre su propia historia y siempre y cuando podamos encontrar las buenas intenciones en los otros.
We go to the next slide, please. I really love that quote, by the way, it was Doña Maria Ruiz Santis. We'd like to learn how to change everything so that equality is achieved. I think that's kind of just why we're all here today and doing this kind of work. So next, we were curious to hear from you about your tools and approaches for obtaining data and input for your own equity-centered evaluation that would then inform your strategy. So if you go to the next slide, we're going to kick off another poll. So this time we're asking, what approaches have you found most valuable in informing your global philanthropy planning and evaluation? Is it conversations with community and NGO leaders, input from grantee partners, focus groups, surveys, or existing needs assessment studies and other research? Or is it something else? And if it is something else, please feel free to share that in the chat box. And as we wait for the poll results, we can actually go on to the next slide. So here are a number of ways for funders to obtain evaluation information and learn, what is happening with efforts they are funding. All of these methods can have quantitative or qualitative aspects, and we've organized them both on the grants level and at the strategy level. And I'm not going to go through all of them. You're likely familiar with many of these approaches, but something that we'd like to emphasize is that, anything on paper creates work for your grantee partners and, can only go so far in terms of really contributing to the kind of learning and communication that you'll want to foster with your partners. It can also reinforce power dynamics that are really anathema to centering equity, since it places the onus again and the labor on your grantee partners and ultimately those that you're ultimately trying to benefit in the community. We advise having conversations as much as possible to hear directly from those doing the work and to get a more holistic view of the context and the programs and the impacts, and then the next steps. the more interactive these conversations can be, and as collaborators, the better. And you should be continually asking yourselves, is this information necessary? Is it actionable? And does it reinforce values related to equity? And I think we have our results from the poll. So the largest percentage of you, nearly 88%, said that conversations with community and NGO leaders are the approach that you find most valuable in your global philanthropy planning and evaluation. And that's followed by input from grantee partners at around 12%, with nearly, actually, I don't think anyone else indicated that the other options were most valuable to them. And I think that reflects a lot of what we've been talking about today, where, it's usually most helpful to go right to the source, to have these conversations with those external partners, with your grantee partners, with those in the community, and that sort of proximate relationship building can go such a far way in actually giving you input and giving you information that will actually be most valuable for your evaluation. Can we go to the next slide? So, I mentioned before asking yourselves those questions, whether the information was necessary, whether it was actionable, and whether it really centered your values related to equity. And if your answer to those questions is yes, the next questions, or the next set of questions is, what is your data? What exactly is going to be your input source? First, you might begin with what's already out there and look at existing research and data, all of which hopefully reflect the experiences and opinions of the community or stakeholders you're trying to impact using that equity lens. Things like assessments, community indicators, or the field scans and power maps that Sebastian mentioned earlier can help answer some of the big picture questions about the demographics and the number of your target population, and what other organizations are doing in the field or community, and how they're measuring their own progress and processes and impact. This will also hopefully reveal some of those power dynamics and asymmetries in the community or region you're working in. Similarly, you might look at other evaluations to see the kinds of data that those evaluations have prioritized, both quantitative and qualitative. And next, you might turn to your own, internal stakeholders. Those might be foundation trustees, senior leadership advisors, and most definitely your program and support staff, to really ensure you're being as thorough as possible and collecting feedback from those who work most closely with those you're trying to serve. And finally, of course, you'll want to collect data and input from those external stakeholders and resources that we've mentioned earlier. So depending on your objectives, this might include the grantee partners, this might include their clients and those they serve. You might turn to peer funders whose work you respect, thought leaders, we mentioned before, community and NGO leaders. But really, it's about recognizing that some of the most important and diverse voices have to come from outside of that silo and will ultimately be a really rich source of data as part of your evaluation. Next slide. So these are some key questions for funders to consider. And this is just a handful of them, and I won't go through all of them, but we wanted to offer these as a way to begin deeper conversations for all of you, both internally with colleagues or with external stakeholders. These questions include how to go further in engaging diverse voices, designing evaluations that are multiculturally valid, and that strengthen the work of your grantee partners. And remember, at the bare minimum, that the exercise of asking yourselves these questions is one very important step forward. The questions also touch on the notion that evaluation can be in service of equity, and it's time to embrace a more accurate and complex understanding and commitment to validity, one that is appropriate in a global context that takes into the local culture and history and power dynamics that are likely different from community to community, and your evaluations have to reflect that. So this means co-designing and co-producing improvement and sharing power with those who are most affected by the current inequities in our system. And now I'm going to pass things over back to Leslie.
Thank you, Joe. And Sebastian, thank you for responding to what's actually a pretty big question that one of the participants raised about how to think about different grants budgets and project budgets. And there was a follow-on question about small and mid-sized donors and, those who maybe are supporting existing efforts, and it can be harder to really build in the types of evaluation approaches that we've been talking about, perhaps. But on the other hand, it's, there are ways to just engage in conversations, again, to Joe's point about getting input in different ways from stakeholders, both internal and external, but in the community, just really figuring out. And for some smaller donors, I've seen examples of where donors get directly involved. Of course, it's harder internationally, but get directly involved as volunteers with organizations that they might be supporting or they are considering supporting, and that can be a great way also to really get a better and up close understanding of what the work is and how it's going and what's happening at the community level. So that it's a complex question and a lot of different ways to answer it, but and we can circle back to it as well if Sebastian
could
or
I add
Joe
something?
have thoughts.
Sorry, I just wanted to add, and I think this is a great question, and I've thought about it a lot, and I think it goes back to our evaluation practices and just really thinking what we're trying to achieve. And sometimes I think we see smaller goals or smaller actions as less impactful. But I think when we are very clear on what we are trying to achieve and how to measure that, it's really different from just, I don't know, I've seen initiatives that have very good intentions but are not clear on what they are trying to achieve. And I think this doesn't matter. Of course, the bigger the size, the more complex sometimes it gets. But the smaller the size, sometimes I don't think it's downplaying the effect you can have on community. I've seen amazing initiatives that were very clear, that were very well structured, and that have a very close connection to community that really responded to a priority and had a very significant impact. So again, I think it's just going down to the basics and having those conversations and having those clear results very, very closely defined with community. And then just at the end of the day, measuring if the actions that you proposed at the beginning had the impact that you intended.
Yeah, the other comment that I'll just add is for some funders, it's less about looking at it in terms of the size of the grant or project budget, and it can be more about what category your grant falls into. For many funders, they are putting some resources towards their strategic efforts that are grounded in a theory of change and very specific goals and things that the funder really wants to change or be part of a change effort. And there might be other types of funding that a donor is putting resources towards that are more responsive or that are supporting efforts that that have to do with relationships that the funder has. And in some cases, those are not about trying to evaluate the impact of those kinds of grants or gifts. So there can be different types of grants and grant initiatives and strategies, and so that's just something to factor in terms of thinking about when and where to really emphasize evaluation and different types of evaluation approaches. Okay. Well, we're going to spend our last few minutes doing a little bit of a wrap up, and let's move to the next slide. Really want to encourage folks to give some thought to where you are in the process of developing equity-centered strategies and evaluation approaches and where you want to go with that work. I suspect some of you are at an early stage. We got a little bit of a sense of that from some of the earlier polls. perhaps working to define or clarify your philanthropic mission and goals. Others may be further along in developing theories of change, strategies, equity-centered evaluation approaches. And it does sound like many of you have been moving along that trajectory in some really important and powerful ways. And then, of course, the process, regardless of where you are, requires some planning to really determine how you will engage and elevate voices of diverse stakeholders and what resources you might need to move the work forward. Next slide. So we offer this construct as a very simple tool that can be helpful to some in really defining or thinking about your next steps, considering where you are now and how you might go further in centering equity in your overall goals, strategies, theories of change, and evaluation approaches. And again, just a tool that you should feel free to use and play around with and see if it helps you to point you in some directions for where you want to go next. Next slide. So as you think about where you want to take your own work, we offer a series of questions that really summarize some of what we've talked about during this session. And some of these questions, again, can really help you to shape your own roadmap. On the left side of this slide are questions about ways to obtain input from and elevate voices of diverse stakeholders. And these all really circle back to things that we've been talking about. And then on the right-hand side are questions about how to incorporate these diverse perspectives into your efforts to strengthen or modify or potentially revamp your philanthropic strategies and approaches. So these questions: who should be involved in that process? What kind of time frame are you really operating under and looking at in terms of how you're assessing progress towards goals? What kinds of mechanisms might you use to analyze and reflect and learn from key findings and lessons? This really important question: how will your findings help to inform and influence development and refinement of future strategies, grant-making decisions, and going even further, really, how could key findings really be shared more broadly and help to influence those that you're working with, the communities that you're in, other funders, and more. So yes, this idea of sharing with internal and external stakeholders is something we really encourage all funders to give some thought to that. And it's not always something that's easy to find the time for or the way, ways to do that effectively, but so important to do that. I'm gonna ask Joe and Sebastian both to share any final comments, words of wisdom, any parting thoughts that they might have as we close out this session, and still looking for any questions that folks might have if there are any others, but because we do have a couple more minutes. One thing that I'll start off with some final thoughts, and one of them is just the importance of approaching all of this work with what we call a beginner's mind. And again, this goes back to some of the discussions over the last couple of days, as well as what we've talked about in this session. But just this idea that even for funders that have been at this work for a very long time and have been really immersed in the issues that they're working on and the changes that they're trying to make, there's such value in approaching everything with an open mind and really also being open to thinking about different approaches and innovative ways that funders might think about how to move things forward and how to move the needle on the issues that you really care about. So just really encourage everyone to keep those thoughts in mind. And with that, I'm going to invite Joe to share any comments, and then we'll close out with Sebastian.
Sure. I'm actually responding to a recent comment in the chat box from Yvonne, who very astutely points out again that monitoring, evaluation, and learning isn't free, and it's a theme that I think has emerged throughout today's talk, where funders need to be very mindful about sort of the cost of evaluation. While we can all agree that evaluation is very important, it should be done really thoughtfully and really needs to take into consideration the capacity of their partners to do this kind of work, and recognizing the fact that when you ask for certain kinds of data, when you collect input, when you ask questions, it is taking up time and resources from your non-partners, perhaps from doing other kinds of work that are equally important. So just something to think about when you are designing your evaluation and considering, again, some of the downstream effects of what evaluation you construct will have on those that you're trying to partner with.
Thank you, Joe and Leslie. Yeah, no, I completely agree. I wanted to go back again to this issue around how costly evaluation and learning in general is, and how important is that we as funders invest on our grantees and communities to be able to do these activities with resources. I think that's crucial. One thing that I was thinking about globally, I think it's also, that's why the pre-work entering community is so important, because sometimes our indicators, our goals and strategies are not culturally responsive, and we want to hold grantees and committees that we don't know to our standards or to our concepts or to our indicators. And so that's why it's so important to do that pre-work on, and we've seen this in so many different levels, but just that calibrating the expectations of the funder from a deep understanding of local culture and what's going on in the community you're partnering with, I think is crucial. And the last piece, I think, is this learning approach, and how important it is to look at evaluation as learning, but also I think there's some risk we can assume from philanthropy to support that. It both from the perspective of the grantee and our perspective, in saying maybe the indicators we chose was not great, but that doesn't mean that the project was not successful. Is what do we need to shift in our practice in evaluation and learning to adjust to that, to what we're finding. So even a bad evaluation in terms of outcomes not being met or metrics not being met is a good evaluation if we get to learn and shift practice. And so I think that's also crucial, because sometimes we're so focused on, and I know, I mean, we all have, or most of us have boards to report to. We all have indicators to collect, and we will, but what are we learning from that process? And how our practice is shifting and how our grantees' practice is shifting.
Well, I hope that everyone has gotten some helpful tools, approaches, ideas, thoughts, insights from this workshop. And we really want to thank all of you for joining. We'd love to hear from you. And we know that 80 minutes is not really sufficient time to get into the kind of conversation and depth that a topic like equity-centered evaluation in a global context really calls for, but hopefully this was a good start. So I hope everyone enjoys the rest of the symposium. Bye now.